Okay, we're going to start with the brachas. Guys, I want to have you in mind. You have the bracha in mind. And we're going to add the English because it just adds to the kavanah. That's what. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'suk b'divrei Torah. Amen.
Amen.
Baruch na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu v'fi b'cha beit Yisrael. V'niyeh anachnu v'tzeitzeinu v'tzeitzei b'cha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yodea shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai l'mei Torah le'amo Yisrael. Amen.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher b'chabanu mikol amim. V'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten Torah. Amen.
Amen.
Blessed art you, Adonai, God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and has commanded us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. Please, Adonai, our God, sweeten the words of your Torah in our mouth and in the mouth of your people, the family of Israel. May we and our offspring and the offspring of your people, the house of Israel, all of us, know your name and study your Torah for its own sake. Lishma. Blessed art you, Adonai, who teaches Torah to his people, Israel. Blessed art you, Adonai, God, King of the universe, who selected us from all the peoples and gave us his Torah. Blessed art you, Adonai, giver of the Torah. Amen.
Amen.
Right. Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, Siman Min Aleph. That's where we are. And in the subsection Kuf Yud Tet. Okay?
Yeah.
So now we know that some of the stuff you know, some of the stuff you don't. So obviously, if you have any of the 5 grains of bread, and you have a complete bread. What do we say about complete? In Shabbat, for example, in Yom Tov, you need to have 2 loaves, 2 complete loaves, and during the week 1, but it should be complete if preferable. You have to have a kazayat at least, but the 5 grains, does everybody know what the 5 grains are?
Wheat, spelt,
Yes.
barley,
Yes.
oat, and dates.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Barley, yeah. So, so there you do hamotzi. Now, the thing of it is, people think that if they do hamas or not, it's the same that you don't have to bench. There are certain cases. Let me remember. So you have to do the bracha of benching fully if it's mizanot, if it's a filling meal, and if you have more than a certain quantity. So either if it's filling or you have more a certain quantity, and you must note that this is the same case at which you have to have the time in which to bench. You must know, even if you're having one of the 5 grains, as you know, there's an opinion of 72 minutes. There's also an opinion that if you become hungry again, you've got a bit of a problem in terms of benching. So it's the same thing with mizanot. Now, we all know that when we vas, that there should be no hefsek between vasing and doing hamotzi. Now, do you know what a hefsek is, guys?
Interruption.
Delay.
Hefsek means an interruption. So you can't have any delay. Exactly. You can't have a delay. Did you say delay or today?
I said delay.
Delay is correct. It means there's a delay. So in other words, even we learned when you have a bracha for food, you can't do the bracha before you do a eitz and ha'adam ma, and then wait for that food to cool down. Because that's a delay. Your food has to be at an edible temperature. So if it's something that you have to prepare, like you shouldn't be able to use an orange and then say the bracha for eitz and then peel the orange and eat it. That's a hefsek. That's a delay, Michael. So what you do in that particular case is you peel the orange first. And it's the same thing when food is too hot and you have to wait for it. You need to let it cool down to the point that you can eat it before doing a bracha. Does that make sense? So you can't have any delay, any hefsek. Now, what's considered a delay between, an interruption between vasing and hamotzi? It's either the period of time that it takes to walk 11 meters or 22 amos. Now, we're not saying if your vasing is 11 meters away that you can't go and vas. But you can't have wasted time. In other words, if it's towards a purpose, you can go ahead and vas. But you can't go aimlessly in a direction that's 22 amos for no purpose. Does that make sense? And there are many people that have the custom to have a vasing sink or a vasing bowl quite close on their sideboard, the cat, close to the sideboard to where they're actually going to be doing hamotzi. Now, I do want to tell you that, do you know that many people re-vas if they talk between vasing, accidentally talk, and they do hamotzi? Okay?
Yeah.
So there's two rules there. If you, for example, respond and say amen to the brocha, that's not considered a hefsek. It's related to the brocha. And if you say pass the salt because you need salt, that's not considered a hefsek, a delay. It's within the same activity. Okay? So one other thing that you've got to bear in mind is that you shouldn't talk between. But if you say something that you shouldn't, according to Rabbi Zaltzer, you shouldn't rewash. Why? Because you're creating a hefsek on a hefsek. You're creating mark or a delay on a delay, which means it's non-creative. In other words, you shouldn't do it, but Bili Eved, after the fact, you should just immediately do hamotzi. Rewashing without a brocha is going to just further delay you. There's only two reasons that you rewash without a brocha. That is if you're involved in another actual maisa, an action, not a cat that I've got here, but not a cat and maisa, as Kevin likes to say, but a maisa being an action, meaning if there's an actual act that separates the two activities, in that case you have to revas without a brocha, or you're talking sufficiently to where it's creating a real disturbance, of which case you're not going to be invited back anyway. So you should revas without a bracha. But other than that, you shouldn't, if you say a couple of words, revas. That's a misnomer that people do in the community, according to Rabbi Zaltzer. Good, guys, we've done nice halachas in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. I hope this has been helpful. And we are busy on 12a2. And we were dealing with a very, very difficult issue that ended on 12a1. Okay? So we're going to deal with this now. Just hang on a second. All right, so initially there was a discussion with Rav Nachman and Ulla quoting his teacher Rav Elazar, and we said that Rav Nachman holds that there are two problems. Firstly, that he regards slaves as movables and not as land, okay? Movable assets or movable property. And Rav Ulla, in the name of Rav Elazar, constitutes slaves as land. And Rav Nachman says that even if it is in respect to being viewed as land, according to certain issues like price fraud and the laws of oaths. You know, we said this is in Bava Basra 128a and Yevamos 99a. In that case, it's a biblical enactment in those two cases. There are a couple of others, but the fact of it is that to be able to collect a debt from a person that owes money to a creditor is a rabbinic enactment, and therefore rabbinic enactments for him count. And the rabbinic enactment is that slaves are seen as movable property, despite those two cases, biblical cases. Does that make sense? Because Rav Nachman is going purely on the rabbinical cases where it said slaves mimic movables. They don't mimic land. All right, so now that we've got a summary of how this was discussed, because we discussed the rule of the prosbul. Remember, you can only take a prosbul upon debts secured by land and not debts secured by slaves, which proves, according to Rav Nachman, that it's a movable. And that you can require movables together with land, but you cannot require movables together with slaves. So those are two proofs. I hope I've summarized well, guys. I hope this has been decent for you as a summary. All right. Fine. So now we're saying that this seems to mimic another issue between the Tanaim, an earlier argument. So let's get this clear, 12a1. So what was the dispute between the other Tanaim? If one sold slaves and land, and now we're going to 12a2, the buyer performs a proprietary act upon the slaves, he has not thereby acquired the land. And if the buyer performs a proprietary act upon the land, he has not acquired the slaves. If he purchased land and movables, and he performed a proprietary act upon the land, he has thereby acquired the movables. But if he performs an acquisition upon the movables, he has not acquired the land. If he was purchasing slaves in movables and he performed a proprietary act upon the slaves, he has not acquired the movables. And if he performs an acquisition upon the movables, he has not acquired the slaves. Okay, so this brisa seems to rule that slaves are treated as movables. Does that make sense?
Damon, what's a proprietary act? Just give a practical example.
Okay, so
you build on the land, you build something on it.
It's a good question. Good question. So if you have a company that's a PTY limited, it actually means it's a proprietary limited. So a proprietary act is an act of acquisition that is now your property. So if you're the proprietor of a business, it's an old-fashioned term. It means you own the business. Sorry, Kevin?
The owner. You own it.
The owner. Yeah, you're the owner.
Okay.
So a proprietary act is an act of acquisition where you now become the owner. Okay.
Sure.
So that's a good question. So let's break up the statement. So before we get to the second brisa that seems to contradict it, the first brisa is fairly clear. It seems to imply that slaves are treated as movables. So why? If he performed, let's go to that brisa again. If the buyer performed a proprietary act upon the slaves, he is not therefore acquired the land. Why? Because with movables, you can't acquire land. Is that correct, guys?
According to that brisa, yes.
No. Stop. Not according to this brisa. Both the brisas are trying to fit in with the law. So what I'm saying is...
Well, rabbinically, you can't.
Kevin, I don't understand what you're saying.
Okay, just continue. It's fine.
No, I don't understand what you're saying. What I'm saying is that the rabbinical law is what's enacted. We're only talking about a case of oaths and of the price fixing. There's an exception. We haven't hit that issue in Bava Basra yet. That's way in the end of Bava Basra and when that exception applies. But for the sake of acquisitions of property, movable property, you can't acquire land through movable property. Okay, so that's a fact. So when we say that if you've got slaves, you can't acquire the land by having slaves, we're therefore proving that slaves, it would seem, is regarded as movable property. Does that make sense? We're breaking up each part of this brisa. And then it says, if the buyer performed a proprietary act upon the land, he has not acquired the slaves. So that seems to be a bit of an issue for me. Because if you're trying to prove that slaves are not regarded as movables, we had learned that movables can be acquired when you purchase the land. So this particular part of the brisa to me is contradictory. Does everybody see why?
Yeah, it seems like, if you buy land, slaves generally work on the land, belong to the land. You don't want to go and lift them up and take them somewhere else necessarily. You want to take it with the land.
Yeah, that's correct. But here what we're seeing two contradictory statements to me. Now, in other words, the Gemara is bringing this as a proof that slaves are treated as movables. And I'm picking up a problem here. I'm just being honest with you guys. That if I'm looking at 12a2, it says the buyer performs a proprietary act upon the slaves. Let's call it an acquisitionary act because it's a bit of a tongue twister rather than the word proprietary. Okay, the buyer performs an acquisition act upon the slaves. He is not thereby acquired the land. So fine, that makes sense that therefore you can't acquire land from movable property. So then I can see in that statement slaves are deemed to be movable property. I get that. But the next statement of the brisa to prove that slaves are treated as movables doesn't make sense because it says if he performed a proprietary act upon the land, he has not acquired the slaves. Because if slaves were regarded as movables, if he performed a proprietary act upon the land, he could acquire the slaves. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
What I'm saying.
No, due to you just left one sentence out, due to the fact that if you acquire land, you by default should by default acquire the immovable property.
Not at all. There's something called a kinyan agav. So kinyan agav is acquisition in dint of. It's today in law. It's not an automatic acquisition.
Not currently, not in today's law, but in those days.
No, it wasn't, Gav. It wasn't. It
Okay,
was,
I'm
there was a
assuming.
specific, no, I'm explaining. There was a specific, you don't automatically, even in those days when you had auctions, there wasn't a case where you automatically got everything lock, stock, and barrel, okay, at all. So what happened is you could purchase, for example, a farm with the farm equipment and the mules to pull, because in those days you didn't have tractors, there wasn't electricity or petrol or whatever. So you do that, but you would have to create a Kinyan Agav. And a Kinyan Agav is a proprietary act. You also would need an Stein, the document, and the way money transferred hands. It's not automatic. That's why it's called a Kinyan Agav. It's, in other words, if it was automatic, you wouldn't have a law of acquisition in the dint of.
Yeah, but there were three options. I remember something like one, if you had already acquired the land and it was in your possession, then I think the what's it called, the loose immovable properties belong to you. If you hadn't acquired the land yet, then no.
No.
There were three options in that price.
No, Gavin, you're mixing it up. I think what you need to do is just let me finish and let me go over it, because no disrespect, I think you might have misread it.
No, not might have. I think I have, yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's just do this again, guys. The buyer performed a proprietary act upon the slaves. He has not thereby acquired the land. That makes sense, because if a slave is seen as a movable, not Marco, immovable, a movable. Okay, sorry about my diction. I owe you an apology. A movable asset. Then you can't acquire land with a movable asset. So that first part of the brisa makes sense to me. The second part of the brisa did not automatically make sense, because it said if he performs a proprietary act upon the land, he has not acquired the slaves. Because if slaves are seen as movables, he should be able to acquire the slaves if he performs a proprietary act upon the land, if he's doing a Kinyan Agav. And here it's saying he's not. Okay, so that to me is not necessarily a proof that slaves are treated as movables. Let's go on. If he purchased land and movables and he performed a proprietary act upon the land, he has thereby acquired the movables. But if he performs an acquisition upon the movables, he has not acquired the land. Fine. If he was purchasing slaves and movables, he has performed a proprietary act upon the slaves, he's not acquired the movables. That makes sense, because you can't acquire movables with movables. Fine. So there we see slaves are required as movables. And if he performs an acquisition upon the movables, he has not acquired the slaves. Right. Because again, movables cannot acquire land or movables. So that makes sense. The only part that doesn't make sense, upon which you have to read further down in this particular daf, is that if he performed a proprietary act upon the land, he has not acquired the slaves. Okay, so we're going to see when we study the daf later that a slave is not treated as a clear movable in certain respects, in that a slave is a movable legally, but there has to be certain requirements that he has to be on the field. And why is that? We're going to go into that. So when you initially read this brisa, it's not necessarily a proof, that particular part of the line of the brisa, that slaves are treated as movables. It's only when you read further in the brisa as to why the acquisition of the land does not necessarily acquire the slaves with the Kinyan Agav, that the slaves have to be on the land, that it explains that slaves are still considered movables in this particular brisa. Does that make sense, guys? This brisa is quite this whole daf's quite confusing, and I had to read it to make sure all the other anomalies afterwards are put as the rule instead of the exception to the rule. So we're going to go through that. Fine. Now, there's another brisa that's taught. If a man was purchasing slaves and movables, and he performed a proprietary act upon the slaves, he has acquired the movables. So that would seem to indicate that slaves is considered land, because you can acquire the movables through acquiring slaves. So it says, is not this the point that they argue? In other words, the one master, the Tana of the second brisa, holds that slaves are regarded as land, while the other master, the Tana of the first brisa, holds that slaves are treated as movables. And this almost seems like a repeat of a discussion between Rav Nachman and Rav Ula in the name of Rav Elazar. But there's obviously got to be maybe tangible differences. Otherwise, it's just that they're holding like these brasses, or maybe there's something a little bit different of this brasa. But before we go there, I need to just give some sort of clarity to you guys. Okay? So, in Kedushin 22b, a Canaanite slave can be acquired in any one of these three ways. That land can be acquired. So this is the proof, by the way, the second one, that in the second brisa, that it's seen as land. Does that make sense? So in other words, by means of money, by means of a document, a shtar, or by means of a chazaka. Now, a chazaka is a proprietary act or an act of acquisition that demonstrates ownership. Okay, so it seems to be that in Kedushin 22b, that this is how land is acquired and slaves mimic it. But we have a bit of a problem. What is the problem? Because it implies that to a certain extent, some of these things are mimicked in movables. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. In other words, when you are buying a movable, you are, say you're buying an ox, you're also performing an act of acquisition. Didn't we learn this, guys? There were three acts of acquisition. The one was Mashiach. Okay, so there were three. The one act was to take it from the buyer's domain to the seller's domain, or a neutral domain in the public domain that was used to transfer from the seller's land. The second one was to actually grab the horns or the reins, which the buyer would give to the seller, or the buyer would just instruct the seller to grab that. And then that's Masira, that's not Masicha. And then you've got a case of Hagba'ah. It's like Hagba. You know when you lift the Torah, guys? Hagba. So it's when you had to take it off the land, the animal, you had to raise it off the land of the seller. So that's also in Kedushin 26a. I read it. Okay? And that's when you elevate the animal by like an elephant. It uses the case of Kedushin where you raise it off the land where it's no longer technically on the land of the seller. So this is a law of acquisition that also seems to be that even whether it's land or movables, there are acts of acquisition. Now, what I was going to say to you is if you acquire a wife, by the way, why is this in Kedushin? Why is this in Kedushin? Because Kedushin are the laws of engagement and marriage. So when you get married and you only need one of these three things. But when you get married, you do the same thing as though you require, how do I say this politically correct? As though you're gaining a Canaanite slave. There's no tactful way to say this. Is that, where that you give a ketubah. A ketubah is a shtar, it's a document. And that is a document of acquisition saying that I will betroth myself to you, I will look after you, I will take care of you, etc. And within that, it's a responsibility of the husband to the wife. Okay, then you have a chazaka. A chazaka is a proprietary act. Now, what do we consider proprietary act in marriage, guys? We've got 10 minutes.
A ring.
Yeah. No. We have, that's an act by means of money. That, in other words, a slave can be required in three ways: by means of money, a document, or a chazaka, proprietary act. So the ring, Kevin, you're right, but that's the means of money.
The physical act?
What, guys?
The physical act?
Yes.
Yeah.
Beer doesn't mean you have a beer with your wife and you have a beer afterwards. You can have a scotch, you can have a beer, whatever.
Political.
But beer means the acts of sexual intercourse with the intent to acquire your wife. In other words, it's a physical act. So that proprietary act is the act of of acquisition by means of money is the ring, and a ketubah is the shtar, the document. Okay, that's what's mentioned in Kedushin. In terms of Canaanites, slave can be acquired in any of the three ways. Let's not just go down that rabbit hole. Let's not discuss that. The kinyan of a gov allows only movables to be acquired along with land. It does not allow land to be acquired with land, as you know. So even if we were to view the slaves as being purchased as land, their acquisition would not be able to affect the acquisition of the land. Okay, so that we learned. All right. So it's pretty clear that there's two ways to view it, according to the first and the second brisa, is that slaves are seen as movable assets, or they're seen as land, as fixed property. All right, how long do we have left, guys?
8 minutes.
Great. All right, so let's tackle a little bit more. It's not unreasonable. All right. Now, what we're trying to see is there a bone of contention between the two? Because it looks like the two brises of each master is holding the opposite. The second one according to land and the first one according to movable. But Rav Ika, the son of Rav Ami, said it's possible that all the Tanaim agree that slaves are treated as land. So he wants to give this first exposition. So according to this understanding, the brisa that teaches that one who buys slaves and movables and performs a proprietary act upon the slaves has acquired the movables. So then the second brisa is clearly understood, because the second one is clearly pushing as though slaves are regarded as land. So it's saying that if the first brisa, in fact, is not understood as being movables, it would seem that way, and it's seen as slaves are regarded as land. How do we interpret it? So the brisa teaches that he has not acquired movables in such a case, because in order to acquire movables along with land, we require that the land be similar to fortified cities in Judah, which does not move. Thus, movables cannot be acquired with slaves, even though slaves is treated as land. So I'm going to share the screen and explain this to you guys quickly. Just give me a sec. Yeah, I've got it. Let me quickly share the screen. All right, guys, can you see this?
Yeah.
It says, from where do we learn this matter? And their father gave them great gifts of silver and gold, of precious things, with fortified cities in Judah. So what we learn is that even though slaves, according to the opinion of Rav Ika, is that even though slaves are seen as land and you can acquire movables with them, how it's explained you can't acquire movables with them is not because it's not considered land. It's because that slaves move themselves. They're physical, but legally they're seen as land. Does that make sense? We still have to discuss the presbo issue. Don't worry, that's an issue all of its own. But what he's basically saying is as follows, is that in order to acquire land, it has to have more than one characteristic of being land. It has to actually be immovable. So Rav Ika, the son of Rav Ami, said that if you were looking at this issue in Kedushin, it's that the land is fixed, it's fortified, and therefore slaves cannot be able to acquire movables, even though they act legally as land, because they're not stationary. And we learn that fortified cities, that land can acquire movables because it uses the word together with. It doesn't say that there were many gifts of gold and silver and delicacies and fortified cities in Judah. Because if it said the word and fortified cities in Judah, it means that the two have nothing to do with each other. The fact that it says together with, it means that when you've got land, you can, together with the land, take the movables. So it's saying, yeah, it doesn't necessarily, according to Rav Ika, the son of Ami, state that slaves are treated as movables. In fact, they can be halachically regarded as land. They just can't acquire movables because slaves are mobile. And one of the requirements in Kedushin 26a is that they have to be fixed. Right, now I've got to give you just another particular opinion, and I'm just going to stop sharing the screen. Okay, I hope I've added clarity, guys, in terms of where it is. Right. So we learn in a Mishnah, movable property can be acquired together with real property by means of money, a document, or a proprietary act. So where do we derive these laws? Chizkiah said, for the verse states, and their father gave them many gifts of gold and silver and delicacies together with their 45 cities. There's not 45 cities, guys. It's 45 cities, mean protected. Sorry. Okay. The Gemara presents another version of Rav Ikka's solution. So Rav Ikka is now saying something different. He's saying maybe it's possible that all the Tanaim agree that slaves are treated as movables, not as land. So how do you work this out? So it's very clearly understood by the first brisa, because you can't acquire movables with slaves. But according to the second brisa, what are we talking about there? So he says that how do you acquire, because the second brisa turns around and says that that slaves, that if he performed a proprietary act upon the slaves, he has acquired the movables. So he was saying, hang on a second. The slaves are still regarded as movables. It's only when they're movables on the slaves. In other words, a slave is wearing jewelry, or the slave has got things on his physical property, that you can acquire it through there's a special term. And that term is known as chatzir, which means a courtyard. Okay, which means anything on your person you can acquire. Does that make sense, guys? Meaning that a slave is still a movable. Just because he's acquired movables doesn't mean it's like he's acquired oxen or things like that. He's acquired movables maybe in terms of precious stones or coats or things that are on his person. And therefore a slave, in that case, can still be seen as a movable himself, because it uses a different type of acquisition, a chatzir, meaning it's on his person. And there's a proof of this in Exodus chapter 22, verse 3, and Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. And it brings the context of theft and receiving a bill of divorce. Okay. And it's also in Bava Kamma 10b to 11a. Okay. And it brings it in Gittin as well, 77a. So Rav Ikka explains that movables are not required through kinyan of a gav, but through the mechanism of chatzir. One has acquired the slave, then he acquires the movables held by the slave, since they are his chatzir, which means his courtyard, meaning they're his movables, and his movable is wearing his movables. Okay, we're going to go through this next time. How many minutes have we got left?
1 minute.
1 minute.
All right, guys, I hope you have a wonderful day. And I want to thank you very, very much for the share. It's going to become clear in time.
Thanks, guys.
Sure.
All right. Pleasure, guys.
Thanks.